For Native Americans, the Revolutionary War was quite a tough decision to make. On the one hand, uh, there was, well, let me just say that they kind of decided to join whichever side, depending on the colony that they were next to and how well they got along with them. Because remember, Native Americans aren't just one group of people. No, they're a whole bunch of different tribes. You know, they all kind of exist, and they've been fighting each other for years, and they didn't always get along. Some of them did, some of them didn't. On the one hand, the the colonists, were their neighbors. So they were next to them. If they got along fine with them, then they joined on the colonial side, and they fought against the British if they were treated well. On the other hand, if the colonists had been like mistreating the Native Americans, had been trying to steal their land, the British had actually protected the Native Americans against the colonists and forced them to not expand into the Native American land. So Native Americans kind of sided with themselves, right, to try to protect their own land. And for many of them, that meant that they had to fight on the British side. We have two groups here: the Algonquin Indians and the Cherokee tribe. The Cherokee, especially in the southern parts of the southern colonies, they fought with the British against the colonials, and got this reputation. As a result, when the war was over, Native Americans got kind of shafted. They kind of lost the protection that the British gave them, and they were portrayed as having sided with the British, and so they became really unpopular. And so, like, Americans didn't really feel any problem with like shoving them out. In the Revolutionary War, you don't hear very much about ship-to-ship fighting or Navy ships. For one big reason, the British Navy was the best Navy in the entire world, and it would be for the next, several hundred years. The American Navy, there was a small Navy, and you are looking at the first American naval hero. His name was John Paul Jones, and he was in command of an American ship named the Bonhomme Richard, which had been given to the United States, to the American colonies, by the French, and they used it to attack British ships, especially British supply ships, to try and steal their food, guns, weapons. They're kind of like acting like a pirate, and the British called him a pirate, and he called himself a American sailor, and so the most famous, he's the father of the American Navy. In his most famous battle, he took on a ship. His ship, the Bonhomme Richard, had 42 guns. The ship he took on had 50 guns, so it's slightly bigger. But he had a couple other ships with him, and they began to fight. And he was attacking the convoy. The convoy managed to escape because the two British ships, the Countess of Scarborough and the Serapis, engaged. And there was a pretty tough battle, a pretty bloody battle. The ships pounded each other with their guns at really close range, and at one point, it looked like the American ship was in trouble, and the British commander asked, sent over a message: "Are you going to surrender?" And John Paul Jones is reported to have said, "Surrender? I have not yet begun to fight." You know, and that became the message that was spread throughout the whole land. We have not even begun fighting. And anyway, as the battle went on, the ships kept pounding each other. The Countess of Scarborough was sunk. The Bonhomme Richard was on fire, and the another report is that the British commander said, I'm going to do whatever I can to make you strike your colors. Strike your colors means surrendering. And John Jones is reported to have said, I'd rather sink than strike. Anyway, the two ships are so damaged that much that eventually the British surrendered. They gave up. Their ship was like a wreck. Their people were killed. This is where people jumping over and fighting with swords and stuff. Anyway, so John Paul Jones won. They beat the British ship, and so like even though it was bigger than they are, and anyway, but his ship was so damaged that he had to take all of his sailors and move on to the British ship because his ship was about to sink. But anyway, so that's the story of John Paul Jones. Now this is a painting by John Trumbull called "The Death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17, 1775." And it's a pretty famous painting. It's, kind of what everybody kind of pictures as the Battle of Bunker Hill. Uh, but what I really want you to focus on is in the bottom right corner. There's a guy standing there with a sword, and behind him is an African American guy. That man is Peter Salem. He's one of the many African Americans who fought on the Continental side. It's at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Here he's helping the guy Thomas Grosvenor retreat, because if you remember, the Battle of Bunker Hill was an American loss. Uh, he joined the Colonial Army, Continental Army. He fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill. He fought for a number of battles, including the Battle of Saratoga, and he kept on. He served very honorably and lived, survived the war, and continued to be an example for, well, just about everybody. Now, we don't talk much about women in the American Revolution. Women, of course, were there. They did all of the, they were part of the protests. They were part of the agitation. They were part of, well, just about everything. But we only know about a few people. So let's talk about some of the few that we know, and some of the stuff that is kind of, well, is legend, and some of it is definitely true, right? The first most famous person of the woman of the American Revolution is, of course, Betsy Ross. Betsy Ross was the wife of John Ross, who was the nephew of George Ross, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So she kind of knew all the important people. She lived in Philadelphia, and she was actually quite young and reportedly, very pretty. She is famous in legend for sewing the first American flag, the stars and the stripes. And the legend has that George Washington came to her and said, I need a flag, and so he wanted to put in these stars, but reportedly he wanted the six-pointed stars, right? And Betsy Ross told him, well, it's easier to make five-pointed stars. So she did, fold, 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 cut, boom, boom, five-pointed star. And so she convinced him, no, let's put in five-pointed stars and they'll be better. And that's why the American flag has five-pointed stars today. Now, is it true that she made the first American flag? Well, we can't prove that, but we can prove that she made a whole bunch of flags for, for all the armed forces, for the Army, for the Navy. She made a lot of flags. She did a lot of sewing. Right. Now, Martha Washington, of course, is George Washington's wife. We talked about her a little bit, about how she helped rescue the soldiers at Valley Forge, and by working and by sewing and, well, just spending her own personal money. Right. Now, the two other women we're going to talk about actually took part in the fighting, and it wasn't really allowed for women to fight in those days, but well, let me tell you about Molly Pitcher. Molly Pitcher is kind of well, there could have been a couple of different women, but the most famous is Mary Ludwig Hayes. She was married to this other guy named Hayes, and William Hayes, I think, joined the army and was trained to be a artilleryman. That means he shot the big cannons. And her job, she went along with her husband and took part in a whole bunch of battles. Her job was to carry water. Right, she would, bring water to the cannon, bring water to the soldiers during the fighting, because her husband is the cannoneer, the guy who's shooting the cannons. He's a little bit back away from the fighting, and because her name was Molly, and she's holding a bucket of water, a pitcher of water, she got her name because the soldiers would always be yelling, "Molly, pitcher," meaning that we need some water over here, and so she'd bring the water. Well, the story is at the Battle of Monmouth, during the fighting was really, really intense, and her husband was wounded. He collapsed and had to be taken away to the hospital. Good news is he did survive, but anyway, the middle of the battle, her husband is wounded, and but the battle's still going on. So she picks up his equipment and keeps on loading the gun and keeps on firing it and keeps on loading the gun and firing, and and reportedly one of the bullet came, there bullets like flying all over the place, and went right through her legs, and tore a piece of her dress off. And the story goes, she said, well, that could have been much worse, and kept on fighting and kept on shooting the gun. Anyway, this so she did take part in the battle. Now, Deborah Sampson, on the other hand, is another famous woman who took part in the Revolutionary War. Except she's one of those people, and you hear about them in history, and a number of them in the American Revolution. She was a woman, but she wasn't allowed to fight, so she disguised herself as a man. She pretended to be a man, and according to the story, she was a pretty tall woman. She is also reportedly not like super beautiful, but pretty tall, pretty broad, and so it was fairly easy for her to pretend to be a man. She enlisted, and she joined, and she fought in the war in several battles. In fact, there's one story that she was wounded. She was shot. She was shot in the leg, shot in the head, and so she went to the hospital, and the doctor took the bullet out of her head. But before he could take it out of her leg, she left. Why? Because, well, if he he took the bullet out of her head, but if he was going to look at her leg, he'd realize that she was a woman. So she left and took the bullet out herself, and reportedly, had to limp the rest of her life. She was eventually discovered that she was a woman, but by that time the war was over, and so instead of like punishing her, they gave her a honorable discharge, and so she's regarded as a heroine, a hero of the Revolution, and so she has her statue up all over the place too. Now this is Sally Wister. During the Revolutionary War, she was 16, and she started writing a diary. Well, actually, more like letters. She started writing letters to her friend, and in it she describes what it was like during the Revolutionary War. Around her home, there was actually several battles took place, so she could hear the gunfire. The soldiers were around her, and she describes what it's like being around the soldiers, and apparently, she kind of fell in love with one of them, and never married, but just describes what life was like. And her journals were collected and published in the 1900s, and so we have a kind of a really good idea of what it was like for just regular people back then. Now, after the Battle of Saratoga, the war began turning south with a lot of battles there. Remember, the British had changed their strategy. They decided to concentrate their soldiers in the southern colonies. Why? Well, for one reason, there were a lot more loyalists down in the southern colonies. A lot of people wanted to stay loyal to the British, so they concentrated their forces there to try to capture those colonies. A lot of the battles took place. Battle of Moores Creek, called the Lexington and the Concord of the South. Americans did win a number of battles because they engaged in what we call guerrilla tactics. It has nothing to do with monkeys, but guerrilla tactics means fighting against bigger, how do you defeat somebody who has more soldiers and more guns than you? Well, you don't stand up and fight against them. You kind of you fight and then you run away. You shoot and then run away. You shoot and then run away. And if they have more soldiers, they'll keep on chasing you, but eventually they're going to get tired. And if you know the area better, then just a few people can take on a much bigger army and maybe not win, but at least keep harassing them until they kind of want to give up. Now let me tell you the story of Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold was a general in the American Army. He fought he captured Fort Ticonderoga. He fought in the Battle of Saratoga. He was actually one of the better generals that in the American Army, and Washington trusted him implicitly, which means he really believed in him, and he put him in charge of West Point. West Point is today it's the U.S. Military Academy, but back then it was a fort that controlled the river, and so it's really super important post. Well, Benedict Arnold, though, he was kind of a difficult guy to get along with, and not very many people liked him. Right? He was really good at being a general, but he was really bad at getting along with people. He People didn't like him, and so he kept on getting passed up on promotion. People didn't. He didn't get promoted the way he thought he should. Plus, he liked to spend money. He would go and spend money and buy rich things. And even though he didn't have that much money, he would, he'd spend, he'd gamble, he'd do all kinds of stuff. He also liked to hang out with loyalists. In fact, he married a girl who was from a loyalist family and who actually had lots of friends with in the British Army. And so while this is going on, remember there's a war going on this whole time, and so he's kind of an interesting guy, but kind of problematic. All right. Anyway, at some point, I think he was mad at having been that people didn't like him, that he didn't get the promotion he wanted, that he didn't that he didn't see that he didn't think that the Americans were going to win the war. So he decided he's going to sell West Point to the British. He's going to let them capture the fort. And how to do that? Well, you got to give him the secret passageways. You give him the secret codes. And he was sending all this information to the British. He was sending, how many soldiers that George Washington has. He is sending them, how many guns, how much food, all this kind of information. And so the plot was he was going to send the information to the British to allow them to capture West Point. Okay, so if he is turning traitor, he is going against the people who believed in him, that he fought for. And so, but it fell apart, and here's how it fell apart. He met with this one of this spy, who was going between him and the British. He gave him the secret messages, and the British spy sailed back to Boston, where the British soldiers were. But on his way back, the ship he was on was attacked, and so he had to get off the ship and travel across the country to try to get there. And as he was traveling across the country, he was captured. He was captured by 3 American militiamen. And they found the secret papers, and they traced it back to Benedict Arnold, and Benedict Arnold, had to run away. He had to escape and join the British, and he actually joined the British Army and fought a couple battles against the Americans, the ones he had been fighting with. And so, in history, he's got this really bad reputation. To call somebody a Benedict Arnold is to call them a traitor, somebody who betrays your country. And he didn't end up very happy, actually. He had to eventually move to England, where a lot of people still didn't like him, and he kind of died kind of an unhappy guy and had a really bad reputation, of course. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase "the tide turns." What it means is you stop losing and you start winning, right? The one moment where everything starts to change, the turning of the tide. The Battle of Kings Mountain, the Patriots rally in October 1780 in South Carolina. Like I said, guerrilla tactics. Some of the most famous are Francis Marion. His nickname was the Swamp Fox. Daniel Morgan and the Battle of Cowpens. Nathaniel Greene. They continually fought against the British to wear them down. You know, you're never going to win against them, but you're going to wear them down so much that they get annoyed and they kind of go, "Is it really worth it? Is it really worth this fighting?" And remember, this is 1780. They've been fighting for 4 years already. If you ever seen the movie The Patriot, it's based not on a real person, but it's based on these three guys. He kind of like used the tactics of not standing up to them and fighting in nice orderly rows, but shooting from the trees, hiding and shooting and running away before they can come back and get you. So the war is starting to wear down the British, and they are starting to realize, what are we really fighting for? So the British kind of decide, we're going to try to consolidate our forces. We're going to move everybody back up to north to a place called Yorktown in 1781. It's 1781. The war's been going on for 6 years. It's going to go on for 6 years, and it doesn't look like it's going to end. But all of a sudden, Washington gets news. Lord Cornwallis, the British general, has decided to pick all of his soldiers and put them together. He's moving his army, and he's going to try to regroup and try to take over. But Washington realizes this is his opportunity. The British have finally made a mistake. They've gone to Yorktown, which is a peninsula, which means that it has water on three sides. And they're a fort there, and they've fortified it. But if he can get there quickly enough, he can get there before the British have all of their soldiers there. He can trap them. And so he quickly moves all of his soldiers down to Yorktown. The French have finally shown up. The French suddenly show up with their navy. And yes, the British have the best navy in the world. But if the French can get there and cut off the British and keep the British navy from coming back in to help give more supplies to Cornwallis, then all of a sudden they have him trapped. They have the British general trapped, along with the main British army. And all of a sudden, this is their opportunity. So Washington quickly sneaks all of his soldiers down to Yorktown. The French Navy quickly cuts off the British Navy and surrounds Cornwallis, and he's trapped on this little tiny fort with all of his soldiers. And he is running out of ammunition. He is running out of supplies. The Americans are shooting at him and firing, and he can't get any more supplies. He's trapped, and he knows it. They call this the world turned upside down. The mighty British Empire, which owned the colonies. All of a sudden, the colonies had become independent. They had fought a war, and all of a sudden, they had won. They had won. Once the Lord Cornwallis surrenders, October 17th, 1781, it's over. It's over. They have finally defeated the British Empire. And, everything that everybody knew to be true was suddenly not. All of a sudden, it's now possible. You can become independent of a king. You can have a country that's ruled by, a democracy that has no king. This is the first time. And all of a sudden, all the people around the world began to look at this and say, what? We don't have to belong to a European country? The Americans did it. They have succeeded. They began talking peace in 1782. The Treaty of Paris recognizes the United States as a separate country. It is independent. It no longer belongs to Great Britain. The Americans have their independence. Canada remains part of Great Britain. It's a part in green. Louisiana was claimed by the United States and Spain, and so, as you can see, Mexico and South America. The purple area, claimed by Spain, Russia, and England. But the United States exists. It is now the United States. It is no longer part of Great Britain. Congratulations.